The sea on a winter night has this strange way of softening everything, like it's pulling a heavy blanket over the world. Up above, a pale half-moon floated high, laying down a thin streak of silver light that shimmered across the dark Pacific swells. Each wave rose and fell with the kind of steady rhythm that felt eternal, untouched by the war-tearing continents apart. The only sound was the whisper of wind sweeping over the water, faint and cold. To any sailor keeping watch that night aboard a Japanese destroyer, it might have seemed peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. The kind that hides danger beneath its calm. Because under that glimmering skin of ocean, a hunter waited. That hunter was us, the USS Archerfish, a Balao-class submarine of the United States Navy. She stretched 311 feet from bow to stern. Built from welded steel and painted a dull, ghostly gray. When she surfaced, her conning tower was barely a shadow against the moonlit waves. When she slipped under again, only her periscope and radar mast broke the horizon. Inside the steel hull, the air hung thick and heavy, tainted with oil, sweat, and the steady pulse of machinery. We moved quietly through the narrow passageways, our footsteps careful, our voices low. Every man aboard knew his job, every movement precise, deliberate. After years of war, that silence wasn't just habit, it was survival. But even so, there was something different about this night. Something big was in the air, something that felt like history turning. At the center of it all was our skipper, Commander Joseph F. Enright, 33 years old, dark-eyed, and carrying a reputation that had once been uncertain. He knew what failure tasted like. On a previous command, he'd hesitated when it mattered most and come back from patrol without firing a single torpedo. For a submarine captain in wartime, that wasn't just disappointing. It was a mark of shame. Enright had even asked to be relieved of duty back then, convinced his instincts had betrayed him. He never let himself forget that. It shaped every call he made afterward. Now, in these black waters south of Honshu, he meant to make things right. I remember him standing at the periscope, one hand resting on the grip, the other working the rosary he kept in his pocket. He was Catholic, not the preaching type, but when the weight of command pressed down, he found comfort in those beads. And tonight, that weight was heavy. Somewhere to the north, past the rocky headlands guarding Tokyo Bay, something massive was moving. The radar operator had spotted it first, a faint blip 12 miles out, holding steady on a southwest course. The contact was big, no mistaking that. Enright felt it in his gut. This wasn't just another freighter plodding through the Pacific. The only question was what it was. Earlier that evening, Archerfish had been on lifeguard duty, waiting to pick up downed American pilots from raids that never came. Once released from that task, we'd gone hunting, and now, by chance or fate, we'd crossed paths with something extraordinary. None of us yet knew how extraordinary. Enright's mind went to the great Japanese battleships, the Yamato and Musashi, giants that had once shaken the seas. Musashi was gone now, sent to the bottom at Leyte Gulf just weeks before, torn apart by swarms of American bombers. Could this be Yamato herself emerging from her hiding place? Or something even more unusual? Something new altogether? The sub gave a low, shuddering tremor as we adjusted course. In the control room, men huddled over the plotting board, tracing lines of relative motion with grease pencils, calling out bearings, cross-checking ranges. Every move mattered. Timing and geometry could decide life or death down here. One wrong calculation wouldn't just lose the target, it could bring disaster straight to us. Destruction could have come from any of the destroyers surely guarding that giant ship. For now, though, the Archerfish kept her distance, running on the surface, using the cover of darkness and a thin line of cloud to hide her silhouette against the horizon. Inside, the tension was thick but controlled. We'd all been living this cramped life for so long that the tight quarters hardly fazed us anymore. The torpedo men slept right beside their weapons up in the forward room. The officers shared bunks in shifts, rotating through them like clockwork. Every man knew his place and could reach it blindfolded if he had to. The air inside was alive with sound, a steady hum of machinery, the faint buzz of fans and pumps, and the throaty murmur of the diesel engines when we ran on the surface. Sweat had stained most of our khakis dark. Some guys had stripped down to undershirts in the muggy heat of the compartments. Nerves had a way of amplifying everything. You could hear the hull creak as the sea pressed in around us, or the slap of waves brushing against the bow. Even the radar's faint buzzing seemed louder than usual. Every sound carried weight. Every vibration felt like a reminder that we were deep in enemy waters. But Commander Enright wasn't about to let nerves turn into hesitation again. He'd made that promise to himself months earlier, sitting across a poker table at Midway. I remember him telling the story later. A senior officer had watched him bluff with reckless confidence and asked, "Joe, would you command a sub the same way you play cards?" Enright didn't hesitate. "Yes," he'd said. That one word, simple, sure, had earned him another shot at command. And now, that chance was being tested here, in the dark waters off Honshu. What he couldn't have known yet was just how big this target really was. The ship we were stalking was Shinano, the pride of Japan's shipyards. Fully loaded, she displaced over 71,000 tons, making her the largest aircraft carrier ever built. She had only been finished days before, rushed out under heavy secrecy. Her systems weren't even complete. Most of her crew were still green, barely trained. She was meant to be a symbol of Japanese strength and defiance, a floating fortress to remind the world the Empire still had fight left in it. Instead, she was steaming through the night toward a single submarine commanded by a man trying just as hard to redeem himself as Japan was trying to survive. The moon slid behind a thin veil of clouds, dimming the horizon to black. In that instant, the sea seemed to hold its breath. Everything went still, eerily so. Enright leaned in again at the periscope, peering into the gloom. The silhouette was faint but unmistakable, huge, steady, flanked by dark smudges that could only be her destroyer escorts. Then one of those escorts suddenly peeled off, cutting sharply across the water, coming straight for us. For a heartbeat, it felt like the hunter had become the hunted. But just as suddenly, the destroyer veered back, circling to rejoin the main vessel. Luck, or fate, had given us another moment to act. "Stay calm," Enright whispered to his officers, his voice low but firm. "Stick with her. Let her zig. We'll find where she straightens out." His words weren't just orders. They were a vow. To himself, to the crew, to every doubt that had ever haunted him. He wasn't going to freeze this time. He'd trust his gut. He'd strike when the moment came. The clock ticked closer to midnight. Somewhere ahead, the largest warship ever built sliced through the dark water, unaware that beneath the surface, we were locked on her trail. The pieces were set. What lay ahead wasn't just combat. It was a contest of patience, precision, and fate itself. The year was 1944. And by then the tide of the war had turned hard against Japan. The empire that once stretched from the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Burma was collapsing inward. The fight was no longer about expansion, it was about survival. Japan's forces were on the defensive everywhere, hammered from the air, strangled at sea, bleeding on every island outpost they still held. The Pacific, once their shield, had become a trap that grew smaller by the month. American troops and sailors had pushed forward relentlessly, leaping from island to island, closing in. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, then the Marianas. Each one fell in turn, tightening the noose. By the summer of '44, the Philippines campaign was in full swing. General MacArthur, true to his word, had come back, leading troops across Leyte and beyond. At the same time, Admiral Nimitz drove the Pacific Fleet ever closer to Okinawa. The seas that had once belonged to Japan now belonged to us. American submarines, boats like the Archerfish, ruled the depths. The silent service was living up to its name, devastating Japan's merchant fleet. Tankers hauling oil from the East Indies were going down faster than they could be replaced. Cargo ships carrying food, weapons, and steel never made it home. By late 1944, Japan had lost more than half its merchant ships. The shortage was strangling them, factories slowing, fuel drying up, supplies running out. The math of war had turned brutal and unforgiving, and Japan was running out of everything that kept an empire alive. There was a time when Japan could afford to lose ships and planes, knowing replacements would roll off the lines soon enough. But by late 44, every loss cut deep. Each vessel that went down was gone for good. The great shipyards that once built the armada that struck Pearl Harbor were now barely holding together, patching holes instead of launching new hulls. Steel was scarce. The skilled men who used to shape it had been drafted to fight, and American bombers were now hitting the factories themselves. Even above the waves, things were grim. The U.S. Navy had become a storm unlike anything the world had seen before. The fast carrier groups of the 3rd and 5th Fleets roamed the Pacific freely, hammering Japanese bases, bombing harbors, and even striking at the home islands themselves. The skies, once Japan's proud domain, had turned hostile. The new B-29 superfortresses, big, silver giants with wings that stretched forever, had begun their long-range daylight raids. I'd heard reports of Tokyo and Nagoya burning, whole districts swallowed in firestorms, and everyone knew more raids were coming. The Imperial Navy, the same force that once ruled the Pacific with confidence and precision, was now just a shadow of what it had been. Its carrier air wings had been gutted at Midway back in 42. The battleships had taken pounding after pounding in the Solomons and the Marianas. And then came Leyte Gulf, the biggest naval fight in history, when Japan threw everything it had left into one desperate roll of the dice. It didn't work. Carriers like the Zuikaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor itself, went down in flames. The great battleship Musashi, sister to the Yamato, was torn apart under waves of American bombs and torpedoes. Even Yamato, the largest warship afloat, barely made it out, scarred and limping home to Japan. The losses weren't just metal and machines. The human toll was crushing. The skilled pilots who'd once flown with deadly precision over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines were nearly all gone. In their place came boys, barely trained, sometimes with fewer than 50 hours in the cockpit before being sent into battle. American pilots, on the other hand, arrived with hundreds of hours under their belts, steady, confident, and well prepared. The result was a massacre in the skies. For every American plane shot down, 10 Japanese aircraft fell, sometimes more. Japan was bleeding out, losing ships, losing men, losing time. And yet, even in that desperate hour, they pinned their hopes on one last miracle. A weapon that could somehow change the tide, even for a little while. But this new weapon wasn't another battleship or a faster fighter plane. It was something altogether different. Something the world had never seen. A carrier so massive, so heavily armored, and so secret that Allied intelligence wasn't even sure it existed. Her name was Shinano, named after an old Japanese province. She was born from the unfinished hull of a Yamato-class battleship, refitted and reshaped into what was meant to be the ultimate fortress at sea. The plan was bold. If Shinano could be completed and deployed, she might anchor Japan's entire defense line around the home islands. She could serve as a mobile repair base, a floating fortress carrying aircraft, supplies, and the new special attack weapons, kamikaze planes and other desperate inventions that Japan had begun to rely on. It was a sign of how far things had changed. The Imperial Navy no longer dreamed of decisive victories won by skill and superior tactics. Those days were gone. Now, survival itself was the goal. Shinano was meant to endure what others couldn't, to take punishment, to strike back, to buy time for a dying empire. And on that cold November night, she was steaming straight into our sights. The new weapons Japan was developing by then were grim signs of how far things had fallen. The ochre-painted, rocket-powered kamikaze planes, and the tiny Shinyo explosive motorboats were built around one idea: that Japanese lives could be traded for American ships at a rate that might somehow even the score. It was a cold calculation, and everyone knew it. But even as Shinano took shape, the war was closing in. The shipyard crews worked 16-hour shifts, exhausted and half-starved, welding steel in the freezing wind. Supplies were short, the quality slipping, and deadlines impossible. The push to finish her was frantic, so frantic that critical safety tests were skipped altogether. The Empire needed her in the water, and it needed her immediately. In Tokyo, the admirals and ministers clung to their illusions. They told themselves that if Shinano could launch with a full air group, she might be able to knock down the swarms of B-29s burning their cities. If she could reach the Philippines, maybe she could disrupt MacArthur's landings. If she could simply appear off Okinawa or Formosa, her sheer size might shake American morale. The war was slipping away from them, but they still hoped that one great ship could slow the inevitable. Desperation, though, is no replacement for strength. Japan's final strategies revealed just how bad things had become. The kamikaze program wasn't a symbol of courage. It was an admission of defeat. Young pilots, some barely 18, were being told that their highest honor was to die by turning their planes into weapons. It was a tactic born of despair, dressed up in the language of duty and sacrifice. The waters around Japan were no longer safe. American submarines prowled the coasts like wolves. Packs of 3 or 4 boats coordinated attacks on convoys, hitting escorts, freighters, anything that floated. By late November, as Shinano prepared to leave the shipyard at Yokosuka, dozens of submarines were already waiting in the approaches to Tokyo Bay. The Navy had divided the area into patrol zones, each sub assigned its own slice of ocean, all reporting contacts to coordinate interceptions. Most of those subs would never know Shinano even existed, but one would, and that single encounter, by sheer chance or fate, would seal her destiny. Anyone looking at the larger picture could see the truth. Japan had already lost the war. The only questions left were how long the fighting would drag on, and how many lives would be lost before it finally ended. But for those still caught inside the machine, the sailors, the shipbuilders, the pilots, that kind of clarity didn't exist. They kept working, fighting, and hoping because the alternative, accepting defeat, was unthinkable. By November of 1944, Japan was an empire under siege. Her seas were stalked by unseen predators. Her skies were filled with firebombs. Her cities shook under the threat of invasion that everyone knew was coming. And into that storm, Shinano sailed, colossal, untested, unfinished, carrying not just weapons, but the last fragile hopes of a dying nation. Waiting for her in the dark, somewhere beyond the horizon, was a submarine commanded by a man searching for his own redemption. Every great warship starts as an idea, a drawing on paper, graceful lines on a blueprint that promise strength and glory. Shinano began the same way, but her fate would change more than once before she ever touched salt water. She was first conceived back in 1940, at the height of Japan's naval confidence, as the third of the mighty Yamato-class battleships. These ships were designed to be the biggest, heaviest, and most powerfully armed warships ever built, floating symbols of Japan's ambition to rule the Pacific. Their armor was thicker than anything afloat, their guns larger, their displacement greater. The Yamato class wasn't just about power. It was about philosophy. Japanese strategists had long understood they could never match America's endless factories and shipyards, so instead, they aimed for quality over quantity. If they couldn't build more ships than the U.S., they would build ships so superior that one could defeat several enemies at once. Each Yamato-class battleship, they believed, would be worth 2 or 3 American vessels. With their 18.1-inch guns, they could hit targets beyond the reach of anything else at sea. Their armor could shrug off shells that would tear lesser ships apart. Those lesser ships never stood a chance against her kind. 2 of Shinano's sisters had already been finished to that original design, Yamato and Musashi. Each carried 9 enormous 18.1-inch guns, capable of hurling shells that weighed nearly 3,000 pounds. Those shells could fly more than 25 miles and punch through 16 inches of solid armor. No naval artillery in history had ever matched that kind of reach or destructive power. Shinano's keel was laid down at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, one of Japan's proudest shipyards, with every expectation that she would soon join her sisters as another floating fortress in the Pacific. The work began with ceremony and pride. Shinto priests blessed the ground. The emperor himself was informed of her construction. The finest steel was set aside for her hull, and the most skilled shipwrights in the country were assigned to the job. The original plans called for her to displace 72,000 tons when fully loaded, to carry the same massive guns as her sisters, and to cruise at 27 knots despite her size. She wasn't just meant to be a weapon. She was meant to be a statement. Proof that Japan's engineers could build something unmatched, something that would dominate the seas. But wars have a way of changing dreams. In June 1942, everything shifted. At the Battle of Midway, Japan suffered a disaster from which it would never truly recover. 4 of its fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed in a single day. Along with those ships went hundreds of Japan's best naval aviators, the veterans who had struck Pearl Harbor with precision and confidence. That one battle flipped the balance of power in the Pacific for good. From that day forward, Japan could no longer rely on its carriers to project power as it had in those first triumphant months of the war. Midway forced a reckoning. Battleships, once seen as the kings of the ocean, were suddenly obsolete. It was the aircraft carrier, and the men who flew from them, that now ruled the seas. The age of the big gun was ending, and the age of the airplane had arrived. At Yokosuka, Shinano sat half-complete in her dry dock, an enormous steel shell of a battleship, while the Navy's planners faced an impossible choice. Finishing her as originally designed would create another giant gun platform in a world where gun platforms no longer mattered. But leaving her unfinished was unthinkable. Too much time, money, and pride had already been poured into her. The answer was bold but inevitable. Shinano would be reborn as an aircraft carrier, not just any carrier, but the largest the world had ever seen. The conversion was radical, almost surgical. Her lower hull, originally built for the needs of a battleship, had to be reshaped for an entirely new purpose. The thick armored citadel designed to withstand massive shell fire was reconfigured to support a hangar deck wide enough to house dozens of planes. Where her great gun turrets were meant to stand, huge aircraft elevators were installed instead. Her superstructure was redesigned and shifted to the starboard side in the familiar island layout of modern carriers. Above it all stretched a flight deck 840 feet long and 130 feet wide, a runway of steel built atop what had once been a fortress of armor. But Shinano wasn't built to launch huge offensive raids like Akagi or Kaga had done in the early days of the war. Her role was something new, a support carrier, a mobile bastion that could repair damaged planes, protect the fleet with her armor, and carry the new suicide craft and explosive motorboats now central to Japan's desperate strategy. Her hangar could hold 47 aircraft ready for service, with space for another 70 stored in crates to be assembled later. She would serve as a floating reserve, a source of fresh planes and supplies for other carriers crippled in battle. It was a design that reflected the new reality of 1944. Japan could no longer gather hundreds of well-trained pilots for grand, decisive air battles. The aces of Pearl Harbor were long gone. The men replacing them were barely trained, many with fewer than 50 hours of flight time before being sent to die. So instead of relying on experience or numbers, Japan now turned to shock and desperation. Shinano would become the vessel that carried that desperation into battle, the Empire's last arsenal of hope. The secrecy surrounding her construction bordered on paranoia. The Navy knew that if American bombers found out what was being built at Yokosuka, they would flatten it before she ever touched the sea. So extraordinary precautions were taken. The entire dry dock where Shinano was being built was sealed under a massive concrete roof, a bunker of steel and stone large enough to hide an ocean giant. This roof, The roof was supported by enormous steel girders that turned the shipyard into a cavernous workshop, a secret world of echoing metal and fire. The men who worked on Shinano's hull rarely saw daylight. They lived in cramped barracks inside the yard, forbidden to leave or write home. Military police patrolled the perimeter constantly, and the workers were warned that a careless word could land them in prison. Or worse, not a single photograph of Shinano was allowed to leave Yokosuka. The secrecy was absolute. Even within the Imperial Navy, few knew what was taking shape beneath that concrete canopy. Only select officers were briefed on her design. Official documents used code names and false designations to hide her existence. When she finally emerged, she would surprise not just the Americans, but even many in her own Navy. That level of secrecy, though, came at a cost. The shipyard suppliers often didn't know what they were actually contributing to, and coordination between departments broke down. Mistakes slipped through the cracks that no one noticed until it was too late. Still, what they were building pushed the limits of engineering. Fully loaded, Shinano displaced just under 72,000 tons, making her larger than any carrier afloat. Her armored flight deck, rare among carriers of the time, could withstand direct hits from 1,000-pound bombs. Along her waterline, 8 inches of armor formed a protective belt thick enough to shrug off most torpedoes. Her vast hangar was divided by armored bulkheads designed to keep a single bomb or torpedo strike from dooming the entire ship. Powering her were 4 massive steam turbines that produced 150,000 shaft horsepower, enough to drive her through the water at 27 knots despite her size. Her defensive armament was formidable. 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns mounted in 8 twin turrets, ready to fire at both planes and ships. Over 125mm anti-aircraft guns were scattered across her decks, arranged to form overlapping fields of fire. And if that weren't enough, she carried a dozen rocket launchers, each with 28 barrels, capable of throwing explosive shells skyward in a curtain of steel. On paper, she was nearly invincible, a fortress so well protected that aircraft would have trouble even getting close. But paper can't capture the truth of war. Shinano was being born in chaos. The men building her were no longer the master craftsmen who had built Yamato and Musashi. Most of those veterans had been drafted and sent off to fight. Their replacements were students, conscripts, and prisoners of war, men doing their best with too little training and too few tools. Quality control, once the pride of Japanese shipbuilding, had crumbled. Welds that should have been X-rayed for flaws were only glanced at. Measurements that used to be exact down to the millimeter now missed by whole centimeters. The pressure from Tokyo was unrelenting. The High Command demanded Shinano be ready to sail by November 1944, no matter the cost. Work never stopped. The yard ran 24 hours a day under blinding lights. Men worked until they collapsed, then were carried off and replaced by others without pause. In summer, the heat trapped under the concrete roof was suffocating. In winter, the cold numbed fingers to the bone. Accidents became routine. Workers fell from scaffolding, were crushed under steel plates, or suffocated from welding fumes. Each death was quietly erased, just another casualty in the race to finish the ship. Even materials began to fail them. The special armor steel once reserved for Shinano was diverted to other emergency projects. Inferior metal took its place. Electrical wiring, once imported before the war, was now irreplaceable. When supplies ran out, they made do with whatever they could find. Systems that should have been redundant became single points of failure. It was a dangerous compromise, a massive ship being held together as much by human determination as by engineering. Yet somehow, despite everything, She took shape. Month after month, her hull rose higher. Her flight deck stretched longer. Her island superstructure began to take form along the starboard side. And to anyone who saw her, even half-finished, she was awe-inspiring. Workers would sometimes stop mid-shift and just stare up at her vast frame in silence. She towered above them like a mountain of gray steel. She wasn't just a ship anymore. She was a city afloat, a symbol of pride and desperation welded into one. She stood there like a monument to human ambition, a mountain of gray steel and sacrifice. On the morning of October 8, 1944, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal braced itself for what was meant to be a moment of triumph. After 4 long years of secret construction, Japan's greatest gamble in shipbuilding was about to touch the sea for the first time. The air around the yard buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just a launch. It was supposed to be a declaration of survival, proof that, even under constant bombing and blockade, the Empire could still summon greatness from ruin. The day began with all the ceremony the Japanese Navy could muster. At dawn, Shinto priests in flowing white robes appeared to conduct the ancient purification rites. They waved wands decorated with paper streamers, chanted their prayers, and scattered salt to cleanse the ground. Near the bow, an altar had been set up with offerings of rice, fish, and sake, gifts to the spirits of water, wind, and steel. The priests called upon the kami to guard the vessel and bless her with victory. By mid-morning, the dock was crowded. High-ranking naval officers arrived in dress uniforms gleaming with medals. Representatives of the imperial household stood solemnly among them. The workers, pale, exhausted men who had lived and toiled under the concrete roof for years, were given fresh uniforms for the occasion. They stood in neat ranks, shoulders squared, pride momentarily outweighing exhaustion. A military band struck up a march. Flags rippled in the autumn breeze. The massive concrete roof that had hidden Shinano for so long was finally opened, and sunlight poured through in bright shafts, painting her hull in gold. The plan for her launch was meticulous. Dry dock number 6 would be slowly flooded through a series of valves, allowing Shinano to lift gently from her supports. Once afloat, she'd be guided by tugboats to the fitting-out pier, where her final systems and armaments would be installed. It was a process Yokosuka had done hundreds of times before. There was no reason to think anything could go wrong. At exactly 10:30 that morning, the order came down to begin flooding. Workers turned the great valve wheels, and seawater began to rush into the dock. At first, everything went exactly as planned. The water climbed slowly, inch by inch, licking at the bottom of Shinano's hull. The crowd watched in reverent silence as the ship began to lift ever so slightly, like a giant taking its first breath. Then, disaster. Without warning, the caisson gate sealing dry dock number 6 from Tokyo Bay gave way. The enormous steel barrier, meant to hold back the sea, buckled under the pressure and collapsed. Instead of a steady, controlled flooding, a roaring torrent of seawater exploded inward with unstoppable force. The sound was deafening, like thunder cracking right out of the earth. In an instant, millions of gallons of seawater poured into the dock. Shinano, instead of rising gently, was struck broadside by a wall of water that hit with the strength of an earthquake. 70,000 tons of steel surged forward like a toy cork blasted from a bottle. She careened across the dock, smashing into the far wall with a grinding, bone-deep crash that shook the ground. The impact sent a shudder through the entire shipyard. Windows shattered a quarter-mile away. Mooring cables as thick as a man's arm snapped like string. The broken lines lashed out across the dock with lethal force. One whipping through a group of workers and decapitating a man instantly, another striking a crane and crushing 3 men beneath it. The great ship, her bow dented and scarred, recoiled from the impact and swung. The ship lurched sideways, her massive stern slamming into the dock's concrete wall. Then she seesawed, swinging back the other way, a 70,000-ton pendulum of destruction. Steel screamed against stone. Everything in her path was crushed like paper. For long, chaotic minutes, there was nothing but panic. Workers ran in every direction, some diving straight into the churning water to escape the swinging hull. Others were swept away by the torrent. Officers shouted orders, but their voices vanished in the thunder of rushing water and grinding metal. The ceremony, that carefully planned display of pride and tradition, had turned into a nightmare. The band's instruments were scattered and broken, flags ripped from their poles. The Shinto altar that had blessed the launch lay in splinters beneath the rising foam. When the water finally settled and Shinano stopped moving, the damage was surveyed in stunned silence. Miraculously, her structure had held. The hull was dented and scraped, with twisted fittings and smashed railings, but the great ship herself was sound. She was built strong, too strong to die that easily. The same couldn't be said for the men who built her. 17 workers were dead. 43 more were injured. Some of the bodies were never recovered, swept out to sea or crushed beyond recognition beneath the ship's bulk. But perhaps the worst wound wasn't physical at all. To the Japanese, ships weren't just machines. They had souls. They were born under blessing, guided by the spirits, the kami of wind, steel, and sea. And a ship whose launch was marked by blood and disaster was believed to be cursed. Whispers spread fast. Men said Shinano had killed before she even touched open water, that the ocean itself had rejected her, that the kami had turned their faces away. Captain Toshio Abe, newly appointed to command Shinano, tried to silence that talk. He was a hard, practical officer, one of the few who had survived the chaos of Midway. And he had no patience for superstition. Standing before his crew, he told them bluntly, "Steel and engines have no spirits. Battles are won by discipline and training, not by omens." But even as he said it, he could see the doubt in their eyes. Sailors are superstitious by nature, and Japanese sailors, perhaps most of all. Many slipped away to shrines in secret, leaving small offerings and prayers for protection against the curse they believed followed their ship. Repairs began immediately, and like everything about Shinano, they were rushed. Damaged plates were patched with fresh welds. Bent fittings were hammered straight. Paint covered over the scars. Within 3 weeks, the physical evidence of the disaster was gone. But the men hadn't forgotten. The image of that monstrous hull thrashing like a wounded beast, the screams of the crushed, the roar of seawater, the chaos that turned pride into horror, lingered in every mind. And there was no time to heal. The November deadline loomed, and the accident had cost them precious days. Work resumed at a fever pitch. Safety standards, already paper-thin, were stripped down even further. Watertight doors that should have been tested under pressure were merely closed to see if they latched. Electrical systems meant for full inspection were glanced over and marked complete. The attitude was simple. If Shinano looked ready, she was ready. Her crew reflected that same haste. Normally, a carrier's crew would train together for months, learning not just their own roles, but how to cover for each other in battle. Damage control, especially, demanded teamwork. Those men had to know how to fight fires, seal off flooding compartments, and keep the ship alive, often in smoke and darkness with the deck tilting beneath their feet. But Shinano's crew was a patchwork. Veterans from sunken ships, raw recruits fresh out of training, even shipyard workers drafted at the last minute to fill the ranks. Many didn't speak the same dialect. The officers tried to run drills, tried to forge a team out of chaos. But time, as always with Shinano, was running out. The crew was too green, too raw. Whenever they tried to run damage control drills, confusion spread faster than order. Men lost their way in the ship's endless corridors, shouting to be heard. Tools and equipment weren't where they were supposed to be. Orders were misunderstood or ignored. It was chaos, the kind that no manual or checklist could fix. And through it all, The talk of a curse refused to die. Petty officers reported men faking illness, asking for transfers, even injuring themselves just to avoid serving aboard Shinano. The ship's Buddhist chaplain performed blessing after blessing, burning incense, chanting prayers, and sprinkling water over the decks. But the more he tried to calm their fears, the more uneasy the crew became. After all, why did a ship need so many blessings if nothing was wrong? November arrived with a kind of grim finality. The deadline wasn't coming anymore. It was here. Ready or not, Shinano had to sail. The American threat grew worse by the day. Intelligence reports said U.S. submarines were swarming Japan's coastal waters, and the B-29 bombers flying out of the Marianas were striking deeper into the homeland. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before they found Shinano still sitting in her dock and reduced her to twisted steel before she ever sailed. The last weeks before departure were frantic. Equipment that should have been installed with care was simply thrown aboard. Crates of spare parts and supplies were stacked anywhere they'd fit, in corridors, on deck, even inside crew quarters. In her hangars, they loaded her special cargo, 50 ochre-painted rocket-powered suicide planes, and several Shinyo explosive motorboats. The weapons themselves were symbols of Japan's desperation, which made them a fitting payload for a desperate ship. On November 11, 1944, Shinano was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was nothing like her chaotic launch. No brass bands, no cheering crowds, no dignitaries from the imperial court. Just a few officers and weary shipyard men standing in the shadow of her massive hull. Captain Toshio Abe read the orders in a flat voice. The rising sun flag climbed the mast, snapping in the cold wind. Shinano was now a warship, at least on paper, but the truth was impossible to ignore. She wasn't ready. Of her 12 boilers, only 8 worked. That alone cut her top speed from 27 knots to barely 20. Her radar systems were unreliable, flickering in and out. Half her anti-aircraft guns had little or no ammunition. The great elevators that would raise aircraft from the hangar to the flight deck had never been tested under real weight. And worst of all, many of her watertight doors, the very barriers meant to keep her afloat if hit, had never been pressure tested. Captain Abe made a full report of the problems, 17 pages of them. He requested permission to delay departure until at least the critical systems could be fixed. The answer came back fast, and it wasn't what he'd hoped for. Shinano would sail on schedule. The reasoning from Naval Command was as much political as military. Word of Japan's supercarrier was spreading fast. They couldn't risk the Americans discovering her as a half-finished wreck in dry dock. She had to be seen. Proof that Japan still possessed power and pride, even if it was only illusion. The orders were clear. Shinano would leave Yokosuka on the night of November 28, 1944. She would steam south along the coast, then enter the inland sea at Kure Naval Base. There, in waters protected from submarines by narrow straits and beyond the reach of American bombers, she would complete her fitting out. The voyage would take about 20 hours. 20 hours. What could go wrong in 20 hours? The crew tried to convince themselves it would be fine. They were sailing aboard the largest warship on Earth, a floating fortress, a triumph of engineering. But beneath the pride was something darker, dread. Letters were written home, quiet farewells sealed in envelopes. Personal belongings were stowed away. Some men visited local shrines, leaving coins and prayers for safe passage. Others turned to the bottle, drinking themselves numb on sack to silence their fears. The escort assigned to protect Shinano was pitifully small. Just 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamikaze. All 3 were battle-hardened veterans, their crews tough and experienced. But their ships were worn out, their radars unreliable, their sonar barely functional after years of damage and patchwork repairs. They would have to rely on human eyes instead of instruments. For the world's largest carrier, It was hardly a guard worthy of her name, but Japan had no choice. Every destroyer left afloat was already committed elsewhere. And so, on the night of November 28, 1944, Shinano prepared to sail into the dark. I stood on deck that evening, watching as preparations for departure began. Steam hissed and built up inside her great boilers, and one by one, the navigation lights flickered to life in the growing dusk. On the bridge, Captain Abe leaned over the charts, double-checking the course one last time. The route itself was simple enough. Head south along the coastline, curve around the Azu Peninsula, and then swing west toward Cura. We'd be traveling under the cover of darkness to stay clear of American bombers, hugging the shore to keep out of reach of lurking submarines. At exactly 6 in the evening, Shinano's mooring lines were cast off. Tugboats eased her enormous body away from the pier, gentle but firm, until she began to move on her own. Her propellers turned slowly at first, then picked up rhythm, sending ripples across the harbor's calm water. For the first time, the mighty Shinano, fresh from Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, was moving under her own power. Despite the rush to finish her, the half-completed systems, and the uneasy feeling that had haunted her launch, she was a sight to behold. Her hull stretched nearly 900 feet from bow to stern, and her flight deck towered 60 feet above the waves. She displaced more water than most harbors could handle. A true marvel of engineering, even if she wasn't quite ready for battle. 3 destroyers formed up in escort. Isokaze led the way, with Yukikaze and Hamikaze flanking the carrier like vigilant guards. Together, the 4 ships steamed toward the harbor's mouth and the dark, endless sea waiting beyond. As we passed through the submarine nets, a few of the crew pointed something out. A dead albatross drifting on the surface, wings spread wide like a white flag of surrender. It made for an eerie sight, and more than one man muttered about bad luck. None of us knew that 30 miles to the south, the American submarine USS Archerfish was just beginning her patrol. That sub had been on lifeguard duty, waiting to rescue downed American pilots from a bombing run that had been scrubbed because of bad weather. Now that the skies had cleared, Commander Enright brought his boat to the surface to recharge the batteries and get some fresh air inside. It was the kind of night submariners dream about. Dark enough to stay hidden, calm enough for sharp sonar, and just enough moonlight to catch a glimpse of a silhouette on the horizon. At 8:48 p.m., the radar operator aboard Archerfish suddenly called out, "Contact! Bearing 020, range 12 miles." The radar showed a large, steady blip moving southwest at around 20 knots. Enright hurried to the bridge, raised his binoculars, and scanned the horizon. There, faint and distant, he could make out a huge, dark shape, and smaller shadows escorting it. His heartbeat kicked up. This wasn't a merchant ship. The speed, the formation, the scale, it had to be a warship, and a big one. "Battle stations," Enright said quietly. All across the sub, the crew snapped into action, each man taking his post with practiced precision. In the forward torpedo room, sailors checked their tubes and readied the weapons. In the control room, others bent over plotting boards, calculating angles and speed. The hunt had begun. But Enright had a problem. The target was cruising at 20 knots, while Archerfish could barely make 19 on the surface. On paper, that meant they'd never catch her. Still, Enright knew the Japanese tended to zigzag their ships to throw off submarine attacks. Every turn would slow them down. If he could predict those maneuvers and cut across their path, maybe, just maybe, he could close the distance. For the next hour, Archerfish raced through the waves at full throttle, her 4 diesel engines pounding. The sub shuddered with the strain, her hull slicing through the swells, spray bursting over the bow. Below deck, the engineers worked like demons to keep everything running steady. Down in the engine room, the crew squeezed every last ounce of power from the roaring diesels. The air was thick and stifling, the temperature soaring well past 120 degrees. Sweat ran in rivers down every man's back. They worked in short, brutal shifts, half the crew darting topside for a breath of fresh air before diving back into the heat to keep the engines alive. Meanwhile, on Shinano's bridge, the radar operators picked up something almost right away. The system wasn't fully functional yet, just another of the ship's many unfinished parts, but it worked well enough to catch a surface contact several miles out. Captain Abe took the report with a grim sort of satisfaction. He'd been expecting submarines. The waters around Japan crawled with them, like sharks circling a bleeding whale. But Abe wasn't caught off guard. He had a plan. "Signal the escorts," he ordered. "Enemy submarine, bearing 170, distance 8,000 meters. Still, it was a tough tactical situation. For all her size and power, Shinano was far from invincible. She didn't yet carry any aircraft that could scout for submarines, and her own sonar system wasn't even operational. That meant her safety depended entirely on the destroyers escorting her, and Abe knew their limits all too well. Their sonar gear had been patched together with cheap replacement parts after taking damage in earlier battles, and their depth charge racks weren't even fully stocked. Supplies were short everywhere these days. Abe faced an agonizing choice. If he sent the destroyers chasing after the American submarine, they'd have to break formation, leaving Shinano exposed to other hidden threats. American wolf packs often worked like hunters driving prey. One sub would show itself to lure away the escorts, while the others moved in for the kill. On the other hand, if he kept his destroyers close, the enemy could just follow them from a distance, reporting their position by radio to more submarines, or even to bombers overhead. After a moment's thought, Abe chose the cautious route. He'd keep the escorts tight and rely on Shinano's speed and maneuvering to throw the pursuer off their trail. "Execute zigzag pattern number 7, he ordered. The helm turned, and the massive carrier began a slow, rhythmic dance across the sea. 45 degrees to port, hold steady for 10 minutes. 60 degrees starboard, hold for 8. Then back to the base course for 15 minutes. Repeat. It was a textbook anti-submarine pattern, but not without its price. Every turn shaved off speed and stretched out the trip. What should have been a 20-hour voyage would now take much longer, burning through precious fuel. And worse, the pattern wasn't exactly secret. A skilled submarine commander could study the timing and predict where the ship would be next. That's exactly what Commander Enright was doing. Inside Archerfish's control room, the plotting team traced every one of Shinano's course changes across a chart spread out under red lights. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bobjinski, the exec, leaned over the table with a pencil and ruler. "She's following a standard pattern," he said. "If we cut across her turns, we can close the gap." What followed was a deadly game of geometry played across the dark Pacific. Every time Shinano turned away, she opened the distance. Every time she swung back, Archerfish sliced the corner, creeping closer. The submarine couldn't match the carrier's top speed, but by taking those shorter diagonal routes, she managed to stay in the chase. It took precise math and a lot of nerve. One wrong calculation and they'd lose contact entirely. One wrong move, and the destroyers would drop enough depth charges to turn them into scrap metal. As the hours dragged on and midnight drew near, the flaws of Shinano's rushed construction started to show. Around 11 o'clock, the engineers reported trouble. An overheated bearing on the starboard inboard propeller shaft. The massive shaft, spinning at high speed, was generating more friction than the bearing could handle. The temperature gauges climbed steadily into the red, warning of a serious problem brewing deep within the ship's heart. The engineering officer was caught in a brutal bind. If we kept running full speed, that overheated bearing might fail completely, tearing the shaft apart and crippling the ship. But if we slowed down, we'd make ourselves an easier mark for the submarine stalking us. In the end, he made the only call he could. He eased back power on that shaft, bringing Shinano's speed down from 20 knots to 18. It didn't sound like much of a difference, but out there, it was everything. That small drop was exactly what Commander Enright aboard Archerfish needed. In the sub's control room, the sonar operator leaned close to his headphones. "She's slowing," he said. Enright allowed himself a tight smile. The numbers had shifted in his favor. The geometry of the hunt was now on his side. But Shinano's problems were just beginning. The long hours of zigzagging, combined with her rushed and incomplete construction, started to take a toll across the ship. Electrical lines that had been thrown together at the last minute began shorting out. Lights flickered in some passageways. In others, they died completely. Ventilation fans sputtered to a stop, and the lower decks turned into ovens. Down in the engine rooms, the heat was so brutal that men could only stay on station for 20 minutes at a time before being rotated out to cool off. Worse still, the constant turning and rolling made the big carrier flex and groan in ways she wasn't built to handle. Some of her weld seams, already weak from rushed work, began to pull open. It wasn't enough to flood the ship outright, but it was bad enough to let seawater seep in. Slowly, almost unnoticed, it started pooling in some of the lowest compartments. Pumps were switched on to clear it, but even they couldn't be trusted. A few failed within minutes. None of them had ever been properly tested before this voyage, and now, under pressure, their flaws were showing loud and clear. Up on the bridge, Captain Abe was handed one report after another, each small problem adding up to something far more troubling. None of the issues alone were critical, but together they painted a grim picture of a warship straining at her seams. Abe had another hard choice to make. He could throttle down even more, nursing Shinano along and hoping to limp into port, but that would make her an easier target for the enemy. Or he could keep her running fast and risk burning out her already fragile systems. In the end, he chose a middle ground, cutting speed again to 16 knots and easing the zigzag pattern to reduce the stress on the hull. By 2 o'clock that morning, November 29th, the deadly cat-and-mouse game had dragged on for over 5 exhausting hours. Archerfish had managed to close the gap to just 7,000 yards. Still too far for a torpedo shot, but close enough to keep a solid track. The submarine's crew was bone-tired but running on pure adrenaline. They knew they were gaining. Commander Enright stared at the plotting board, studying every course change, every rhythm in the pattern. Despite Shinano's evasive maneuvers, one thing was becoming clear. She always came back to a base course of 210 degrees, southwest toward Cure. If he could predict the exact moment she'd level out on that heading, he could move into position ahead of her. That would be his chance to strike. "Take her down to radar depth," Enright ordered. The submarine slipped quietly beneath the waves until only the radar antenna broke the surface. The move cut her speed, but it also made her nearly invisible. Now, Archerfish was truly hunting in the dark, silent, unseen, but watching. On Shinano, tension was thick enough to taste. The crew knew the submarine was still out there, shadowing them hour after hour. Men whispered about why it hadn't attacked yet. Some officers thought the Americans were calling in reinforcements, herding them straight into a trap. Captain Abe brushed off the rumors, at least out loud. But in private, he couldn't shake the thought. The Americans had grown bold and clever in this war, their submarines more coordinated, their tactics sharper with every passing month. At 2:56 a.m., fate finally made its move. Isokaze, the lead destroyer, suddenly reported a possible sighting, a glint of something that looked like a periscope off the starboard bow. Without waiting for orders, her captain pushed the throttles forward and charged straight toward it. The destroyer's bow cut the sea like a knife, throwing up a white surge of foam as she raced into the darkness. The destroyer peeled off and powered up to 35 knots. On Archerfish, the sonar man's voice cracked sharp over the intercom. "High-speed screws approaching. Destroyer bearing 340 and closing fast." Enright had only seconds to choose. Punch the sub into a crash dive and probably lose the contact forever, or hold shallow and gamble on being spotted. He went down, but not deep. only to about 150 feet, shallow enough to pop back up quickly if needed. "Rig for silent running," he ordered. "Rig for depth charge." The destroyer thundered right over us, its screws churning the water into white foam. Every man aboard held his breath waiting for the telltale explosions of depth charges, except none came. Isokazi had lost contact and, worse, she'd broken Captain Abe's order to keep formation. A sharp signal from Shinano's bridge snapped her back into line. The instant Isokazi turned away, Enright eased Archerfish back up to periscope depth. There she was, Shinano, still on course and now only 4,000 yards off. The chance he'd waited all night for had just walked into view. At 3:15 a.m., everything clicked into place. Shinano steadied on her base heading of 210 degrees, broadside to us. Range, 1,400 yards. Speed, 16 knots. In submarine terms, that was about as perfect as it gets. Close enough for a hit, broadside for the biggest target area, slow enough to solve the firing solution cleanly. Enright peered through the periscope and the carrier filled the glass. Massive doesn't even cover it. Her flight deck was a sheer, dark cliff. Her island rose like a city block. I could make out lights in some portholes, the black silhouettes of the escorts, and the white water foaming at her bow. He sketched quickly, noting that odd rounded bow, not like anything in the recognition books. "Final bearing and shoot," he said. "Make all tubes ready." In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 14s were already queued up. Those torpedoes had given the Navy fits earlier in the war with depth and exploder problems, but the bugs had been worked out. Now they were reliable killers, each one packing 600 pounds of Torpex. "Set depth 10 feet, Enright ordered. Shallow, deliberately so. He remembered advice from a senior officer. Hit a carrier high on the hull and you don't just make a hole, you damage stability itself. The fire control party fed target speed, angle and range into the torpedo data computer, an analog calculating beast of gears and cams, and the solution came out. They checked it. Then they checked it again. There would be no second chance. The whole sub jolted as the first torpedo shot out of its tube. A loud hiss of compressed air filled the forward compartment, followed by a dull thunk as the weapon kicked free and sprang to life, propellers spinning fast, 46 knots straight toward the target. "Fire 2!" 8 seconds later, another pulse through the hull. "Fire 3! Fire 4! Fire 5! Fire 6!" In less than a minute, 6 torpedoes were streaking through the dark water, each one a silent promise of death. They ran hot, straight, and true, exactly the way they were supposed to. Faint white wakes marked their paths like ghostly chalk lines leading straight to Shinano's flank. On the carrier's bridge, the lookouts saw the wakes too late. "Torpedo starboard side," someone yelled. "Full rudder," Captain Abe barked. But Shinano's immense mass moved like a mountain, too slow, too heavy. The first torpedo hit before the ship had even begun to turn. The explosion was enormous, a booming, gut-deep sound that shook the sea itself. A towering column of water shot skyward, higher than the flight deck. The carrier lurched hard to port. Before the crew could even react, the second torpedo struck, then the third, then the fourth. 4 hits in under 30 seconds, all along the starboard side, clustered between the bow and the island structure. The first warhead smashed into frame 104, right beside an aviation fuel tank that, by pure luck, was empty. Even so, the blast ripped a 20-foot gash in the hull, flooding nearby compartments instantly. The second slammed into frame 142, obliterating the starboard outboard engine room. The men stationed there never stood a chance, killed instantly as seawater and scalding steam poured in. The third hit at frame 166, tearing open the number 3 fire room to the ocean. The fourth struck at frame 190, rupturing a fuel tank and sending thick oil flooding through passageways. For a few stunned moments on the bridge, nobody moved. The carrier shuddered with each impact, but she was so massive that the hits almost seemed to bounce off. Captain Abe's first thought was that she'd survive it. After all, Shinano had been built on a battleship's hull, armored to take multiple torpedo strikes. But below decks, hell was breaking loose. Those same rushed construction shortcuts that had plagued her build were now turning deadly. Watertight doors that had never been tested jammed or failed altogether. Some slammed shut, trapping men in flooding compartments. Others refused to close at all. Weak weld seams split open under pressure, spraying seawater like ruptured veins. Electrical panels hissed and sparked as salt water poured over them. Damage control teams scrambled into action, but the chaos was overwhelming. The crew had never truly trained together. Orders were confused and contradictory. Some teams flooded port-side compartments to counter the list, while others frantically tried to pump water out. The two efforts canceled each other out, wasting precious time. Down in the engine spaces, things were desperate. The starboard engine rooms were filling fast. Engineers stood waist-deep in cold seawater, trying to keep power going to the pumps. When the rising water hit the live electrical panels, explosions of sparks forced them to pull back. One by one, the engines fell silent. The list kept worsening. 5 degrees, then 10, then 13. Up on the flight deck, everything that wasn't bolted down started to slide. Aircraft rolled sideways, and sailors tried forming human chains to stop them, but it was useless. A refueling truck broke loose and crashed hard into the island. Crates of ammunition tumbled overboard into the dark sea. Through it all, Captain Abe stood rigid on the bridge, his face calm but pale. He ordered counter-flooding to balance the list, then called for a turn toward the nearest land. If they could beach the ship, maybe she could be saved. He sent out a message to Naval Headquarters. Shinano torpedoed. Position 32 degrees north, 137 degrees east, attempting to reach shore. But deep down, I think he already knew the truth. The reports coming in from below were unrelentingly grim. Flooding was spreading out of control. The pumps couldn't keep up. Half the crew didn't even know where their damage control stations were supposed to be. The great ship was dying, slowly, stubbornly, but dying all the same. Back aboard Archerfish, Enright took no chances. The second those torpedoes left their tubes, he ordered the sub deep. This was always the worst part of any attack, the counterstrike. Up above, the Japanese destroyers were already sweeping back and forth, their sonar pinging through the water, crews scrambling to drop depth charges. 400 feet, Enright said quietly. Rig for silent running. The sub slipped down into the cold, black depths. Inside, every man went still. No one spoke. Even breathing felt too loud. They could hear it all, the whine of high-speed screws overhead, the sharp metallic ping of sonar, the hollow plop of depth charges hitting the water. Then came the first barrage, 5 depth charges detonating in sequence. The sub shuddered like a struck drum. Light bulbs popped, cork insulation rained down from the overhead, and tools rattled on the deck plates. But the blasts were far off, 500 yards at least. The Japanese sonar was no match for modern American stealth. It was old, damaged, and badly maintained. They couldn't pin the Archerfish down. More depth charges followed, 14 in all, but none came close enough to do real harm. The pressure waves hit like distant thunder, shaking but not hurting us. After an hour of tense silence, the noise above began to fade. The destroyers had given up their hunt and turned back toward their stricken carrier. At dawn, Enright finally ordered Archerfish up to periscope depth. The ocean was calm and empty. Whatever had happened to that giant carrier, she was gone. Meanwhile, as the first light of November 29th crept over the Pacific, Shinano was dying. Her list had worsened to 20 degrees. Walking across the decks had become nearly impossible. Men had to haul themselves up by ropes to move between stations. Down in the hangar, the ochre-colored suicide planes had broken free, sliding into one another. Their rocket fuel tanks turned the space into a floating fire trap. Flooding had spread far beyond the torpedo damage. Naval architects have a word for this: progressive flooding, when water seeps through every crack, vent, and cable run, spreading like a disease. Compartments thought to be sealed were filling fast. The weight of thousands of tons of seawater was dragging the ship deeper with every minute. Captain Abe made one last desperate attempt to save her. He ordered full speed ahead, hoping to drive Shinano toward the nearest shore and beach her. But only the port engines were still alive. The ship could barely make 10 knots, and with her rudder fighting uneven thrust, she began turning in wide, helpless circles. At 8:30 a.m., Abe gave the grim signal, "Prepare to abandon ship." It wasn't the final order yet, just a warning, but everyone knew what it meant. Sailors began gathering on the slanted flight deck, helping their wounded crewmates up from the smoking lower levels. Life jackets were passed out. The escort destroyers drew closer, ready to take survivors aboard. Below decks, courage and tragedy unfolded side by side. Engineers stayed at their posts, keeping lights on and pumps running until the water drove them out. Medics worked in tilting sick bays, doing everything they could to move patients to safety. In one compartment, 30 men were trapped behind a jammed hatch. Their hammering could be heard for an hour, and then it stopped. The end came fast. At 10:18, the list jumped to 35 degrees. Everything loose. Planes, trucks, men started sliding off the flight deck into the sea. Then the order came, "All hands abandon ship." But by then, it was too late for many. The list grew steeper with every second. Hundreds were trapped below. Others slipped and fell, tumbling helplessly down the slick deck. Some leapt overboard from the flight deck, 60 feet above the ocean. Many never resurfaced. Captain Abe stayed where he was, standing on the bridge. Tradition demanded that a captain go down with his ship, and he was determined to do it with dignity. He tied himself to the helm as the bridge tilted beneath him. Around him, his senior officers made the same choice. Together they sang the Japanese national anthem as the rising water closed in. At 10:55 a.m., Shinano rolled onto her side. Her massive flight deck went past vertical, and then, with a deep groan, she capsized completely. For a brief, eerie moment, her enormous hull was visible. Red anti-fouling paint and barnacles gleaming in the morning sun, before the sea swallowed her whole. For a fleeting moment, Shinano's upturned hull gleamed in the morning sun, massive, red, and scarred. Then, with a thunderous roar as trapped air burst free, she slipped beneath the surface and was gone. The largest warship in the world had survived only 17 hours at sea. When the waves finally calmed, the ocean where Shinano sank was choked with debris and oil, and with men. Over 2,000 had been aboard. Now hundreds fought for their lives in the cold, slick water. The 3 escorting destroyers circled through the wreckage, pulling survivors from the waves. But even rescue at sea followed cruel traditions. Officers were to be saved first. Some captains, hardened by years of brutal war, refused to pick up anyone who panicked or screamed for help. "Save only the brave," one of them told his men. It was tragedy piled on tragedy. Sailors who had survived explosions, fire, and a sinking ship drowned within sight of safety. Some, coated in thick black oil, slipped through the rescuers' grasp and vanished beneath the waves. The winter sea was merciless, cold enough to kill within minutes. By the time the rescue ended, 180 men had been saved. The other 1435, including Captain Abe and nearly all of his senior officers, were gone. It was one of the deadliest single-ship losses of the entire Pacific War. For Japan, the blow was devastating, but it had to be buried in silence. Shinano had been a secret from the start, and now her loss would be one too. Survivors were ordered never to speak of what had happened. The families of the dead were told only that their loved ones had died in action. No location, no details, no truth. The official records were locked away. To the Japanese public, Shinano had never even existed. But secrets never stay buried for long in wartime. American codebreakers, reading intercepted Japanese messages, learned of a massive ship lost at sea within days. The name Shinano appeared in decrypted traffic, along with the coordinates of her sinking. Intelligence officers were puzzled. There was no record of a ship by that name. What had Commander Enright's Archerfish actually sunk? When Enright submitted his patrol report that December, claiming he'd destroyed a carrier larger than any known ship afloat, his superiors were skeptical. Navy intelligence didn't believe him. They credited him with sinking a 28,000-ton carrier. Impressive, sure, but nowhere near the truth. It wasn't until after Japan's surrender, when Allied investigators combed through captured records, that the full story finally came to light. Shinano, fully loaded, displaced 71,890 tons. She wasn't just the largest aircraft carrier ever built at that time. She remains, to this day, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Enright's instincts had been dead on. His redemption, hard-earned and complete. But the story of Shinano's only voyage is more than just a tale of one ship's destruction. It's a lesson written in steel and seawater. It's about hubris and humility, about how grand ambitions can crumble under their own weight, about how even the smallest hunter, given the right conditions, can bring down the mightiest prey. For Japan, Shinano stood as the ultimate symbol of a flawed belief, the idea that a single, decisive weapon could change the course of war. The Imperial Navy had chased miracle solutions, super battleships, suicide planes, godlike carriers. But wars aren't won by symbols. They're won by systems. While Japan poured its dwindling resources into building one colossal ship, America was turning out dozens of smaller carriers. While Japan rushed half-finished vessels into service, America was training its crews, perfecting its logistics, and refining its craft. The outcome was inevitable. The technical lessons were just as harsh. Size without reliability is weakness, not strength. Armor without proper damage control is a false comfort. A warship's true power isn't only in her steel, it's in the skill of her crew, the quality of her workmanship, and the integrity of every weld and seal that holds her together. Shinano didn't fail because she was big. She failed because she wasn't ready. Shinano didn't die because her design was flawed. She died because her construction was rushed, her systems incomplete, and her crew unready. For the U.S. submarine force, her loss proved something they had believed all along, that their quiet, unseen war of attrition could bring even the mightiest giants to their knees. Submarines, small and inexpensive, manned by barely 100 sailors, had the power to destroy ships worth thousands of times their cost. The silent service had shown the world that it could strike anywhere, anytime, and against any target. The age of the submarine as a true strategic weapon had arrived. For Commander Enright, the victory meant far more than just a successful patrol. It was redemption. He'd gone from failure to triumph, from doubt to belief. His story became one sailors told with respect, a reminder that one setback doesn't define a man's career. Persistence and courage do. Enright had faced his own demons, stayed in the fight, and emerged on top. When he was awarded the Navy Cross, it wasn't only for sinking Shinano. It was for refusing to give up after earlier defeats, for proving that grit, patience, and faith in your crew can turn failure into history. But the cost was immense. Over 1,400 Japanese sailors died that night, many of them young conscripts who never wanted to fight a war in the first place. They drowned in flooding compartments, were thrown from the tilted decks, or froze to death in the cold Black Sea. Their deaths achieved nothing. Shinano never launched a single aircraft in combat, never defended her homeland, never justified the enormous effort and resources poured into her construction. Today, Shinano rests almost 4,000 meters below the surface, off Cape Oma. She lies upside down, her flight deck buried in silt, her massive hull slowly collapsing under the crushing pressure of the Dieppe. She is a tomb now, for the men who went down with her, and a monument to an age when nations believed that size was power, that one perfect weapon could change everything. Modern naval strategists still study Shinano as a warning. Even in this era of nuclear-powered carriers and ballistic missile submarines, her lessons hold true. Complexity demands competence. Size demands support. No ship, no matter how advanced or powerful, is stronger than the system that builds, maintains, and operates her. And then there's the matter of chance. Shinano's sinking reminds us that war isn't only about strategy or technology. It's about timing and luck. If she had sailed a day earlier or later, if Archerfish had been patrolling somewhere else, or if Enright's torpedoes had run just a few feet deeper, the story might have ended differently. But on that cold November night in 1944, every variable fell perfectly into place for Archerfish, and disastrously for Shinano. In the years that followed, their story became legend in naval circles. Authors wrote books, historians argued over details, and veterans, on both sides, shared their memories. Each retelling filled in the gaps, refined the facts, and built the narrative we know today. Commander Enright went on to a long, respected career, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. True to his nature, he rarely spoke about that night. When people asked, he'd only say, "We did our duty. The torpedoes worked. We were lucky." Those who served with him understood what that meant. It wasn't modesty. It was the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd earned his second chance and proved himself worthy of command. The crew of Archerfish held reunions for decades after the war. Old men now, they'd gather to relive that long chase. The tension before the attack, the deafening roar of torpedo hits echoing through the hull. They'd laugh, share drinks, and tell stories. But they also remembered Shinano's men. They had been enemies once, but time softened that line. Eventually, they were just sailors who'd served their countries at sea, each caught up in the same unforgiving tide of history. When the veil of secrecy finally lifted in Japan, a few Shinano survivors told their own stories. They spoke of chaos and fear, the lights flickering out, the deck tilting, the thunder of explosions. They remembered the moment the ship began to roll, and Captain Abe standing on the bridge, tied to the helm, refusing to leave his post. They remembered him standing tall, at attention, as the sea rose around him. And that's how the story ends, not with victory or defeat, but with men on both sides doing their duty, bound by honor, and swallowed by the same ocean. They remembered the faces of men who had helped them in those final moments. Comrades who forced open hatches against the flood, who shoved others through before being swept away themselves, who gave up their life jackets so someone else might live. In Japan, Shinano came to symbolize the war's tragic final phase. Grand, desperate gestures that achieved nothing, magnificent failures that only deepened the suffering. She stood as a warning about what happens when pride overrides reason, when a nation begins believing its own propaganda, mistaking appearance for strength, and charging headlong toward disaster instead of facing reality. For America, the sinking became a reminder of something else, the democratic nature of modern warfare. 80 men aboard a steel tube could defeat thousands aboard a floating fortress. Patience, training, and skill had triumphed over size, armor, and arrogance. It was David and Goliath, retold in steel and torpedoes, a lesson that in war, the smallest unit can change the course of history. When deep-sea explorers finally found Shinano's wreck in 2019, they discovered a ship remarkably well preserved despite 75 years beneath the waves. Her hull, built to battleship standards, had resisted the crushing pressure of the deep. But she lay upside down, her proud flight deck buried in silt, her intended glory forever entombed on the ocean floor. A monument not to strength, but to ambition that outpaced ability. Even today, as nations race once again to build bigger and more powerful warships, Shinano's story still matters. Technology moves forward, but the human failings that doomed her haven't disappeared. Ships are still built too quickly, crews still go to sea unprepared, leaders still chase the fantasy that one perfect weapon can change everything. The ghost of Shinano whispers a warning against that kind of hubris. Her final lesson is universal, that in war, As in life, victory doesn't always belong to the swift or the strong. Sometimes patience outlasts power. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. And sometimes a single night's encounter can echo through history, teaching generations yet unborn about courage, pride, and the razor-thin line between triumph and catastrophe. On that cold November night in 1944, two ships met in the vast darkness of the Pacific. One was the largest warship ever built of her kind. The other was a standard American submarine, small, quiet, unremarkable. When the sun rose the next morning, only one was left afloat. That is the truth of war at sea. Sudden, decisive, and final. The ocean plays no favorites. It doesn't care for size, for pride, or for glory. It takes all the same, keeping its secrets in the cold, dark deep where Shinano still lies. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. A giant brought down by a predator she never even saw.